For a while now, I've needed something in a secondary place to record and stream my Xbox, and maybe play some light older game titles. I wanted to tackle this project using older hardware, as you can get some of it cheap on eBay. In this case, I specifically went for an old HP Xeon based workstation, with the HP Z600 coming out on top as my choice. Now let's see if we can make an HP Z600 a usable machine in 2024. The HP Z600 was a workstation class machine that launched in 2009 along the lower end HP Z400 and the higher end HP Z800 for around $1,679, depending on the configuration you went with. The Z600 was the middle ground between the 400 and the 800, offering two CPU sockets like the Z800, but with a smaller footprint like the Z400. On the other hand, it also has less room for drive and card expansions like the Z400 does. These systems supported Intel Xeon Socket 1366 class processors such as the Gainestown chips they shipped with and the later Westmere chips. These machines use DDR3E memory, which is not as abundant as on the used market as regular DDR3 or DDR3 ECC memory. Aimed at productivity, I'm sure HP never envisioned it would end up utilized like the way I intend to. Let's break down the system I'll be assembling today by price point and explain why it's in no way as cost effective as I thought it would be. I picked up an initial two HP Z600s for a bonus deal of $152.95 shipped. This was two machines with RAM, CPUs, and some bonus really bad and cheap NVIDIA workstation cards. But for the sake of today's video, we'll call it $76 for one workstation. Thankfully, I was able to take the RAM from the second system and put it into the first system, so no cost was added there. For my video card, I found an untested GTX 970 for $20.16 shipped on eBay. I got this card and it tested perfectly fine. It was just missing the shroud, which we'll go over later. For storage, I chose a 100GB Micron SSD I bought in a bulk deal, coming in at around $5.50 for one. And then for mass storage, I got a 500GB Seagate hard drive I already had laying around. This brings the running total to $101.70, which isn't too bad. However, the power supply failed in my unit. The first time I turned it on, it went pop, and then it wouldn't turn on again. I found it cheaper to buy an entire extra workstation than a power supply because they were selling for the same price on eBay at this point. This set me back an additional $65.90, but at least I'd have some spare parts for a while. This brings the total cost to $167.60, which is treading into the cost of a decent mini PC from Amazon, which would be more than capable of what I'm looking for, but there's no fun in that. Besides, $167 isn't bad considering the system was 10 times the price brand new with worse specs than I have in it now. Today our build will be utilizing two Intel Xeon E5620s clocked at 2.4 GHz with a boost of 2.66 GHz. These chips carry 4 cores and 8 threads each, totaling for 8 cores and 16 threads. Each chip also brings 12 MB of level 3 cache to the table, which is the saving grace for these 14-year-old processors. Paired with these chips are 12 GB of 1333 MHz DDR3E memory running in triple channel divided up for each CPU. Our choice of video card is the MSI GTX 970 OC edition featuring 4 GB of GDDR5. This card is missing its shroud and that will come back to bite us later during benchmarks. We also have our 100 GB boot SSD and 500 GB hard drive for mass storage. Lastly, we have a DVD rewritable disk drive. I repasted all CPUs and chipsets with fresh thermal paste and cleaned the system the best I could before assembly. Finally, we will be installing a copy of Windows 10 Professional onto the system as it supports multiple CPU sockets. For system benchmarks, I've kept it simple and I haven't included any gaming as this system isn't built to do that anyway. For this part, I would like to apologize in advance for the screen resolution. The main display I'm using for this system isn't even 1080p, so a lot of the screen capture will look rough. In having benchmarked, this system scored a 2,547 on high settings at 768p with frame averages of 100 FPS. This benchmark shows the cruelty of the missing cooler on the graphics card as you could watch the temperature slowly climb into the 90s where it throttles in the end of the test. Although the temps are high, they aren't high during normal recording or streaming, never going above 50°C, so I find it irrelevant for my personal use. The next benchmark is user benchmark, coming in at a whopping failed test as somehow it failed to detect the GPU, even though I did the little graphics gimmicky game thing. Regardless, it rates the system as capable in processing power but believes the drives to be in bad condition, which they are in fact rather old. Lastly, we have Cinebench R23. This system comes in at 4,031 points for a full 16-thread multi-core workload. That is terrible, and for reference is about half the score of a Ryzen 7 1700X. We can really blame this poor score on the age of the chips and the overall low clock and boost speeds. We can see from these benchmarks this machine is no gaming powerhouse, nor did I intend for it to be. Now let's discuss the drawbacks of this system versus anything newer. When it comes down to thermals, the processors are fine due to large tower coolers and obnoxious fan speeds, nothing out of the ordinary for enterprise hardware. Obviously the graphics card is suffering without its fans to keep cool, and I probably will remedy this in some way at some point, but I wanted to avoid sinking money into cooling before I knew the card worked for sure. On top of this, the machine also displayed other weird quirks. For example, I was incapable of booting the PC with my capture card plugged into the back. I don't know if this was the fault of the capture card or the PC, but no matter what BIOS options I changed, the system would hang on the HP boot screen if the capture card was plugged in. If I plugged it in after I booted to Windows, no such issues would arise. Another weird quirk was when watching someone else stream on Discord, Discord would almost always crash about 10 minutes after starting to watch the stream. This was regardless of what I was doing on the system at the time. I could record my Xbox, stream it to Discord, and watch another stream, and it would still crash about 10 minutes in. Lastly, even though you can usually find cheap spare parts for the old systems like CPUs and RAMs, parts such as the non-standard power supply going out could render the whole system unusable as the used markets are drying up of old hardware like this. Very briefly here, I would like to address the potential of maxing out a system like this and why I didn't. Maxing out this system in particular isn't too costly to do. I even have the parts on hand. Tossing in two Xeon X5675s and 24 gigabytes of RAM, and you'd be in a good spot with 24 threads and a gig of RAM for each to match. But the tricky part is the graphics card. This system only sports one 6-pin PCIe connector, heavily limiting the options for the graphics cards, not to mention the tight space, as most cards that are taller than the standard PCIe bracket height aren't going to fit in here. The final kicker for the video card is that the PCIe generation is 2.0, so all the slots in the system run at 2.0, and you'll always be hitting a bandwidth limitation. I suppose the most reasonable pairing might be something like a Founders Edition 1070, but you'd still be using a 6-pin splitter of some kind, and that just turns into a dicey situation. Not to mention these CPUs are going to hold back the card at all, being 14 years old. In conclusion, the HP Z600 Workstation is a decent machine in 2024, but I would not recommend it for a standard computer user. The quirks make it interesting to me, but this machine would be a nightmare for the usual person to juggle day to day. The cost also sets it within range of modern new mini PCs you can buy off Amazon, and they have a fraction of the power draw this system has, basically at the same performance and without any weird quirks. I hope you enjoyed this one, and I'll see you in the next.